Now, grown-ups may find it easy to blame others, but what about children? What happens when a child gets hurt? What happens if the child is hurt by the parent? What about sexual abuse? A child is dependent upon a parent for two things: love and protection. So when the parent becomes the source of hurt for the child, there's going to be fear and there's going to be anger. The problem is there's nowhere for those feelings to go, especially the anger. The child can't blame the parent because, well, that just increases the underlying fear, because the child is dependent upon the parent, so there's nowhere for them to go. That would put them at risk of abandonment or punishment. So the child does what it needs to do, and all that anger gets turned inside, just so the child can take care of its own needs. So the anger gets turned inside. Now the child needs to make sense of things, so what they can often decide is, I must have done something wrong. Now taking the blame means that they don't have to lose the love, they just turn it on inside. But that anger, when it gets turned inside, it takes the form of self-loathing. The child needs to have some sense of control in the world, otherwise they're going to have this ongoing unresolvable anxiety. So a way to get a sense of control is to decide, well, it's all about me. It's all me. That way at least I can change myself. And if I can change myself, this is the reasoning of the child, if I can change myself, then this won't have to happen again. Now, self-blame actually serves a positive purpose. It's basic survival, okay? It's safety and security. That's the subconscious mind's prime directive. But it comes at a cost. When there's no one there to help support the child gets stuck in feeling scared and alone and angry and just trying to make sense of things on its own and trying to come up with some strategies so that it can feel safe. So the child can come to the conclusion that in order to avoid being hurt, I have to take care of myself. I alone must take care of myself. The only person I can rely on is me, myself, and I. Now this is important. It's not what happened that's causing the pain. It's the meaning that the child gave to what happened. That's the source of the pain. Children are making decisions all the time, whether you realize it or not. They're making decisions about themselves, they're making decisions about others, how relationships work, how life works, what to expect. And these decisions are what form a person's worldview. It's their point of view in life. And this becomes our expectations from life. Now, parents' behavior tends not to be a one-time event. So if you are dealing with abusive behavior, then there's generally going to be more than one event involved. And this kind of behavior gets accepted as normal by the child. So if you are dealing with events that involve sexual abuse, there are usually multiple events to be cleared up, and that means compounding. Okay, compounding is building and reinforcing the underlying thoughts and feelings and perceptions involved in those events. And they're also reinforcing the neural pathways that are still being developed early in life. So the younger the child is, the deeper those impressions are going to be. Now, if what happened was not perceived as loving, if the child perceived it as not loving, then that will be interpreted as abandonment. Now, abandonment is a biological threat. It's a threat to survival, and it affects the entire nervous system of the body because the child knows it can't survive on its own. So this generates fear. And that's rational, it's logical, it's reasonable to feel fear in the face of a life threat. If the child concludes, I'm going to die, if that thought crosses the child's mind, there's going to be intense fear rippling through the nervous system. And this can result in dissociation. Now, dissociation is nature's way of protecting the body from having to experience the pain. It's a way of kind of checking out of the body. So in nature, when the hawk swoops down and catches the bunny, the bunny can't escape. It's trapped in the clutches of the hawk. And it's about to be eaten. So what happens is the nervous system goes into a freeze response. It can't run, it can't fight. So the way to escape is through a freeze response. So the body goes numb. And this is just to protect the animal from having to experience the pain of being eaten. Well, the child is like that bunny. There is no way out. It can't fight, it can't run away, there's nowhere to go, so the child literally checks out. So often what you'll find when you're doing the uncovering in an event of abuse is that if the client reports the scene from an observer position, so they're describing as if they're watching the scene from outside, that witnessing perspective is a pretty good sign of dissociation. So you just want to check that out and find out where they're at in relationship to the scene and what's happening. Because what will happen is a child will actually check out of the body and then they'll witness the scene from outside of themselves. Now, this is where clients can get stuck. They can get stuck in numbing out. This can become a habitual pattern. It just becomes a conditioned response to that initial trauma, and then it becomes a way of being in the world, sort of being numbed out, emotionally not feeling. And, add some pharmaceuticals to the mix, and you can end up with a pretty emotional, flat individual. So when you're dealing with sexual abuse issues, it can get a bit tricky because you've got multiple events often to deal with, multiple events of abuse, and this can add complexity and it can also add intensity because it's compounding over time. And there can be more than one ISE. So the ISE is the initial sensitizing event. It represents the first time or the original time. But the question is, the first time for what? So this is where it can get confusing because, some people think initial sensitizing event means that there's just one event. It's just one event for one thing. And so that's the question, for what? It all has to do with how that encounter was perceived at that time. So, for example, what if the first sexual encounter felt good to the child? What if it was perceived to be good? Keep in mind it's not what happened. These are not adult interpretations of the event. It's how the child interpreted it at that time and whatever decisions were made based on those perceptions and interpretations. Now keep in mind that all the child wanted was love. So if the child perceived the event as a way to get attention and it was loving, then it would be perceived as good or interpreted as good. But what if what was happening was confusing to the child? It might have been perceived as loving because it was a way for the child to get attention from someone that was close, a loved one. But there's always some element of secrecy attached to it, and that in itself can generate confusion for the child. Now, confusion is often a signature of the ISE, especially in infancy. That's usually the child's first response. So the younger the child, the more you want to watch for confusion because there's less and less personal history, personal experience with which to compare the experience to. So confusion is just an inability to make sense of what's happening. But it's not about what's right or wrong. The child is not making an evaluation based on right or wrong. Young children get their sense of right or wrong from their parents. They borrow the parents' critical function. So the things that are said to them, the things that are done, that's what establishes the rules about what's good and bad and right and wrong. So what can happen is there can be confusion at the initial sensitizing event because the child just doesn't have the ability to make sense of it, but there's no right or wrong attached to what happened. But then later, maybe it's when the child goes to school, they get introduced to the idea of social morality, and this can form a second ISE. So the first ISE might have been confusing, not a big charge around that. But the second ISC, there can be a real shock, because all of a sudden, this is kind of like the wham in the forehead. The child realizes that what seemed loving, what was perceived as good for all this time, was actually wrong. And this is when guilt gets installed. Okay, the first ISC was just about confusion, not being able to make sense of what was happening. And, there might be some fear there as well, because not being able to make sense of things is a biological conflict, and that does seed a little bit of fear at least. We need to be able to figure out our environment to be able to survive. But the second ISC, that's going to have some juice around it, because it involves guilt and shame. And this can have a retroactive effect on the ISC, because it kind of ripples back along the timeline and feeds back into the original ISC. So maybe there's confusion there, but this then contaminates it with the guilt and fear. Now, these are not based on the child's own perceptions. The guilt and the shame, these are not the child's perceptions. They are based on the opinions of others, and this can seed a lifelong pattern. If you get clients that have a strong concern about the opinions of others and needing to please others, this is rooted in shame and guilt, so watch for that. Now, the perception of love includes lovability, how lovable I am. So the second ISC shatters self-worth. Guilt and shame are just two sides of the same coin. Guilt says, I must have done something wrong, and shame says, I am wrong. It says that there's something intrinsically flawed with me, I'm defective, I'm broken, and the child's reasoning is in absolute. So the child reasons, I'm flawed, I'm defective, and I can't be repaired. Now, guilt is about doing, so it's about behavior, and shame is about being, so it's about identity, it's about who I am. And you need to address both if you're going to get that healing, because it's both sides of the coin. So pay close attention to the story that the client is sharing with you. Get all those aspects involved, all of those perceptions and thoughts and feelings, because the story is going to tell you everything you need to know to find the path to healing for that individual. Now, what you're dealing with is basically a betrayal, and betrayal is always about anger, and it's always about a loss of trust, but it's also about love. It's just that being vulnerable is what got them hurt in the first place, and now the love is all mixed up with the anger, and so it just becomes a confusion and a mess. So you can have relationship confusion issues. But if you release the anger that's trapped in the event, you will find the love. There's always love under the anger. Find the love and you'll find the forgiveness. And trust me, forgiveness is the healing. I hope you found some pointers today that are going to be useful for you in working with clients. Unfortunately, sexual abuse is, you get a lot more of that than people are willing to admit. It shows up in your sessions, and you will get clients coming to you because they want to address sexual abuse issues from their past that they're aware of. So some of the tips that I've given you here today are going to help you, hopefully, in clearing those issues for your clients so that they can feel better about themselves, improve their self-image, release the guilt, release the shame, release the anger, and move forward in their life feeling more whole and more complete than they probably have for an entire lifetime. Okay, that's it for this time. Please leave your comments in the forum. I want to hear from you. And until next time, this is Wendy signing off. See you again real soon.